This is an impossibly complicated topic, actually, because, of course, it fits in the inner world, but it's also a transitional issue, which is what we've been really talking about, is this relational, contextual, very complex relation between the political, social, the intrapsychic, and the relational. This whole weekend, I've been with the Hicklings doing workshops with the Black community here in Montreal, the English Black community, who feel very split from the French Black community, by the way, even though they share so much in common. So this whole weekend actually was about the continuous assault by the Black community here of microaggressions and their very, very deep investment in their children. Because what we're really talking about is transmission over generations of difficulties and the privilege of being in Canada, which is really an incredibly privileged, pluralistic space. And yet, even in this privilege here, you know, when I first set out to be a psychoanalyst, I thought, well, maybe I'm going to find some answers about internalization of racism from Freud, who is my first guru, right, in terms of psychotherapy. But I didn't. What I found was more questions. And I think where we've arrived here at this conversation anyway is about cultural safety and the nuances and the complexities of those these problems. But I really find it's much easier to talk in terms of stories than to talk in terms of some of these constructions. But the biggest thing I can tell you about the literature is the invisibility in the psychotherapy literature actually about racial enactments and racism in terms of countertransference and in terms of micro experiences between the therapist and the patient. And it's only after Fanon, and only after Fanon broke through, in a sense, the issue of mirroring, that we got a huge beginning of something. And Fanon only wrote that one book about which you mentioned. He wrote that book in France, Blackness, and he wrote it in France, but then when he moved back to Africa and to other spaces to write in, he became a revolutionary. He left psychotherapy. So this is a sort of a lost cause because the agendas are so vast. So that in itself is a very interesting issue. And then, of course, we had all kinds of philosophers and Foucault and so on. When we have some wonderful writing by Said, and the first talk we had was about the construction that Said made of Orientalism. That is, how does the West, which was the high culture, construct the other? If we want to go on that journey. And I know Radhika and I were in Istanbul last summer, and there was an exhibition on Orientalism, which was very interesting because it was the Turkish people looking at how they were created by the West, collecting all the ways that the West had created them and reappropriating it into themselves. Now, this sort of reminds me of Lacan and the mirror stage, because in Lacanian literature, and really this begins at the beginning because really race and gender are all there by four. So the individuation of the person and the awareness of race is very well embedded by four. And we live in a pluralistic space. But it was interesting to see that exhibition for us because this deep historical transmission starts to get sent into the child, and then it depends on where our children go to school and with whom and how they're constructed in the space around us. These are not agendas of the therapist, but what's really interesting is how this issue was never in the psychotherapy literature or in the psychoanalytic literature, despite the fact that most of the early literature by psychoanalysts had been by people who had actually endured terrible anti-Semitism, terrible trauma around being a racialized subject. And they stepped aside actually to become a so-called secular subject, a neutral subject. And they washed psychoanalysis of morality. In a sense, they became morally neutral. Of course, it's I think, the most terrible delusion that we ever had in terms of psychotherapy teaching. And certainly in my training, there wasn't anybody that I was supervised who would have taken on dealing with the issues of the racialized subject, or myself as a racialized subject, because there were very few of us who were brown or black doing training. And so one had to wait till you met Suman and other people around the world who are thinking about this, and there are people thinking about this, and there is a literature, a very interesting literature. But a lot of it then goes back to the child at 4 who's washing his skin and wants to be white because he's in the white society, where that's the power society. That's the one that I want to be. And how do I wash this off and become like you? How do I deal with the mirror stage, which is, I need you to desire me. I need you to recognize me in order to love me. And I become what you desire, not what I authentically am, but I make myself desirable to you. And that, I think, is what the exhibition in Istanbul was about. I became what you depicted me as, and now I am restructuring it. And that's a process that could take a society generations, or like Gilles said, there's a history to every. This is a discussion and a discourse that in a certain kind of safe space, unlike the space that Shushwat talked about with the Dalit story of 4,000 years of this continuous transmission, becomes incredibly difficult. But that's another story. It's always easier to move to, so if we took that, and I really do think, by the way, that Sven Lingvid's book, if you haven't read it, Exterminate the Brutes, is something you should all read. Because I think that much of the discourse, even around the charter, I feel, eventually comes back to colonialism. Like Suman said, there's an elephant in the room. Eventually it comes back to how we're colonized and how we see ourselves as colonized subjects, and why these very important philosophical agendas that were discussed earlier have to come up, because we're living in pluralism, we're living in hybridity all the time, we're moving across spaces all the time, and we've developed psychic skins to move from one space to another. And children develop a psychic skin as part of attachment and becoming a self. So I thought I would read you a little bit from a paper called Puncturing the Skin of the Self, which is by my friend Yasser Adebek, who actually has now moved back to Saudi. When I first met him as a resident, he told me he was never going to move back to Saudi. He was going to be here and be a neuroscientist and a psychoanalyst. And around the time of 9/11, he started to change his mind because he was bringing up 2 daughters. And he moved out of Quebec because he felt, I can't live here. And I think that's a very important issue. He wrote a very interesting paper because he was trying to ask himself as an analyst in this dealing with the intersubjective, what is it that's so painful about a racial enactment towards myself, okay, as the analyst. And in the paper he gives a very short vignette of a paranoid psychotic patient who is on the ward, and he comes on the ward, and the patient is sort of sees him, and she goes running to the staff person who's in charge because he's a resident, and she says to him, "Save me from this man," and pointing to Yasser. And the psychiatrist says, "Don't worry, Mrs. S, even though he looks like a terrorist, he really is not." Of course, feeling that he's very funny. And Yasser went numb inside and sort of put it away. And Then 9/11 came, and he had to deal with that, what that meant, because here he saw himself in the terrorist. He saw his father in the terrorist. And of course, it's the last thing that he is. And it's the last thing that his father is. So there's all this sort of very complex repositioning. And he talks about the memory of the racial incident. And he talks about it in terms of an intrapsychic phenomena that required some observation from him. Because here he was with his Saudi identity, people who shared his mother tongue, his color, etc., etc. And he recognized, well, there's a we, and there's a me, and there's an us. And then how do you move between these identities? And you can, which skin do you wear? And he says at one point, at this point I realize why it is that it hurts so much to experience those racist remarks. It was not simply an injury to the self. It was an injury to the skin of the self and the representational structures from which it was derived. It was an injury to my representation of my father. And these words did not just puncture my self-skin. They felt like witnessing my father being stabbed. And agitation resulting from the words felt like a need to ensure my survival through protecting and defending my father. Of course, he's talking of his intrapsychic father. And interestingly enough, it was Freud's very painful experiences seeing his father witnessing anti-Semitism towards his father very early in his life, that was kind of put aside. He said, we're not discussing that. And you don't see racism and the cultural construction of the self in Freud's writing actually until the Holocaust, when because he rewrote monomorphism 4 times, and then it was sort of at the end of his life that he said, no, I have to do this, I have to write this. And Said discusses this with Jacqueline Rose in a very interesting book called Freud and the Non-European. Is that where does the issue and the agenda of the secular, non-God believing Jew, okay, where does he sit with his own father? Okay, because his own tribe, his own identity. And this is getting into stuff that becomes very, very precarious and very, very fragile, because we are built on ancestors and we are built on transmissions. So internalizations go into many, many deep levels of ourself. And I certainly, in child psychiatry, I mean, a lot of my practice now is Black mothers and minority mothers. And what they're looking at, of course, is the evolution and the transmission, what's going to happen to their children if we don't solve some of the problems that are evident in terms of racism. And racism is something that people discuss in my office. And they discuss it at all stages of the life cycle, at the beginning, right through to the end. And it's very important for us, I think, I think apart from the macro level of institutional racism and all the rest of it, to really look at how important some of these internalization issues are, since they go back to the issue of attachment, and they go back to the issue of the evolving self. So if I thought of it in terms of, the people who have really influenced my thinking, Winnicott and the transitional space, Lacan and the agenda of desire, and the issue of Lacan is that at some point, if I have enough reflective function, I need to pull back into myself the pieces that were given to those for whom I constructed a certain self, because that is what they desired. They would not recognize me, they would not have validated me if I was not what they wanted me to be. And at some point, if I'm fortunate enough, I will retrieve it and become my authentic self. So that would be a level of individuation. Jafar Karim, I mean, when in the UK, I remember him getting up and saying to everybody, well, let's just get this out of the way. We're all racists. We all have to deal with prejudice of one kind or another. And we have to have a framework to accept that that is an agenda that we are trying to grapple with. Certainly, many of the people who later came into family therapy work and systemic work addressed it much more full on. They said there's a camouflage issue. We have to take responsibility for what we do. We have to take responsibility for what's in the outer space. And many people began then to, I think you see there's a whole unfolding in literature now where racism is becoming a topic that we see in Arthur Haley's work on cultural distrust. And so many people are beginning to kind of write about these other dimensions because we do believe in a pluralistic society. That is our hope. I mean, most of the people in this room are highly invested in how we would push it forward. Just again, because I think the whole meeting is really about, for me, it's about historical embedding. It's about people like Sempron who can take in the illness of a collective and create something out of it. Because that's what therapists do in many levels. We're not maybe as gifted as Sempron is, but, we are, these kind of stories really were not in our literature until this contemporary wave of writing. So I think we're on a new wave, and as Gilles said, maybe from illnesses and crisis, positive things can emerge. Thank you.